So welcome everyone and good morning. I'm glad that we have such a great crowd today. We're going to start our series of training and technical assistance here at TCCN. We want to be able to share some of the things that we have learned in the process with you, and this will be the first time we do a technical assistant training like this. So if that's okay, I'm going to start with the presentation. Because the idea is for you to ask all the questions you want, you have. We have a section at the end for questions, but feel free to let us know at any time if there is something that you need us to go back and explain. So let me start, and I'm going to share with you a lot of documents that later we can share with you because they're very useful, some templates that we have collected through time. So I hope you can see the presentation. Okay, so this will be, as I said, the first one that we're training and technical assistance number one. In this case, we want to start talking about how to apply for federal and state grants. This is only an introduction, really. I know that there's a lot of information that has to do with grants, but we just want to start slowly introducing you to some terms and how to prepare better for this kind of work. So for today, we're going to start with some introductions. Then later, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics within grant writing, which is mostly important terminology that has to do with federal or state grants. Then we're going to give you some ideas of the things you need to pay attention before you actually apply to the grant and how to get ready. We're going to talk also the application process. We're going to use as an example a recent RFA that we received from the Tennessee Department of Health. We're going to be using that one as for illustration purposes, but we all know, and we have talked about some things that they can still do better, but at least that could help us start the process of learning about the components of an application. And then we also going to allow for questions and answers. And we hope that we have enough time for all this. So that's why we send you the invite for an hour and a half. Pretty soon you guys will meet Tariq Smith. He is currently serving as TCCN's program evaluator and our chief compliance officer. He's a consultant, but he, is very seasoned with research, with grants. He is a social scientist. He has a lot of expertise with program design, all the process, how to define outcomes, how to evaluate your outcomes, how to do quality assurance, and also how to do program compliance. He also works, and it's interesting, I don't know how he has time for all this, because he has two positions with Meharry. The first one is a social community coordinator at Meharry Community Wellness Center, but he's also the director of community engagement and outreach education for the Center of AIDS, Health Disparities Research, also at the School of Medicine at Meharry Medical College. So he does all that. He will be joining us soon. He has a lot of great knowledge, and he explains things really, really simple for all of us to understand. I will also be talking and guiding you about some of the sections of the application. And well, you know me, I'm the Senior Director of Operations for TCCN. My name is Annabelle, for those who doesn't know it yet. And I started working with government for 14 years. Then I've been working for more than 12 years with the nonprofit sector. And I have run all the areas between project management, human resources, budgeting, a little bit of accounting, and that was by accident, but I learned everything about compliance within the financial world that way, and also with operations in general. So I hope that I could share with you today and Tariq everything we have learned in this process. And of course, you all know Mary. She doesn't need an introduction, but she's right there. we want to make a quick disclosure. You know, we really want to share the information that we have learned, and our information, it's based on basic standards that are used by both the federal and state government. Now, there's a lot of foundations that receive a lot of federal funding, and they have also, applied all these basic standards, because, if you meet the federal standard, you understand that you can meet other standards. But this presentation is not really endorsed or approved by the Tennessee Department of Health. Even at some point, we're going to be sharing some of their documents, and
no idea.
Those instances you have.
Excuse me, Annabelle, can you hear me?
Yes, Tariq, I'm glad you're joining us. We just talked all about you and all the different positions you have that we don't know how you can manage your time with all that. So we already introduced you, but Tariq has joined us. I'm talking right now about the disclosure. So we want to make sure that even with everything we shared with you, every time you apply, if you have any questions, you have to contact the program officer or the appropriate contact person with the agency that has released the grant, okay? For today, what we intend to do is really just provide you with an overview and share with you some very nice strategies on how to apply for some of this funding, and make sure that we can all share our knowledge in that area. So we don't intend to be the sole and only experts. We are combined brains. We want to just share with you what we have learned. Well, now let's go to the nitty-gritty of the presentation. Let's start with the basics. What is a grant? And it's important when we are talking about this definition. Most of the information that we are going to share today comes from grants.gov. They have an entire dictionary and terminology about grants. We will be able to share that with you, as well as all the documents that we are going to share today. So based on grants.gov, a grant is a financial award that is given to a qualified recipient. Remember the word qualified, designated for a specific purpose, and usually requires an application. Now let's take this in parts. Financial award, we also, as a nonprofit, receive gifts. So it's a little bit different to what we're seeing here, because a gift could also be a non-financial award of some sort. But in this case, the grant, it's a financial award. But when we're talking about qualified recipients, is that you need to meet some requirements, and the requirements will be summarized in the application or in the documents that the funder is releasing. It has to have specific purpose, and it's usually right there in the introduction when they tell you, I have funding for X. As soon as they tell you that it's specific purpose, and this is for the other participants today, we immediately know that that means that this funding is restricted because it's for a specific purpose. If they say in the grant that this is for operating purposes, fine, it's still restricted, but it's not as restricted as if they tell you this funding is only for a community health worker, or this funding is specifically for volunteers, or this funding, you see, there's always a specific purpose in that document. Once we know that, we need to make sure that all our documents, all they talk is that, okay? But at the same time, that means that there is a specific way of recognizing this grant in our books as a restricted grant. Therefore, it requires an application because you need to show them that you're qualified according to their terms and conditions. You need to show them that the funding that you're going to receive, if you're selected, you are going to use it for the purpose that they have designated. So that is the biggest difference between a grant and a gift. There are some funders here in our community in Tennessee that they do tell you, this is a gift because you're building a new facility that is restricted, but it's usually for that kind of gift, you don't have to create a huge application and you don't have to qualify. You just need to ask. So that is the biggest difference between a grant and a gift. Now, there are some words that we hear constantly when we're talking about grants, and that is the type of federal grant funding, because the Tennessee Department of Health and other of the state agencies that we deal with frequently, what they're really providing us is the opportunity to get, receive some of the federal funding that they received. So let's talk about those basic terms that the federal government usually uses. Competitive grant. That means that there is a competitive process. By definition, the only way that you know that you are competing against another and that you're winning against someone else is because there's some sort of scoring. Somebody's going to evaluate your grant and points will be assigned to different sections, and the one that receives the most number of points, that's the one that gets the award. So it's a competitive process. Now, let me tell you, when usually they receive, the state agencies receive big buckets of funding, they are sort of mandated by the state controllers to do a competitive process. That means that they need to show that they're not benefiting, not doing a benefit to someone in particular, that everybody had the opportunity to apply. Now, there's something called the formula grant. In this case, there is a formula determined within that kind of funding, and the award recipients who may be predetermined by using a formula. Who uses the formula? Well, the funder determines who will get what. It sounds a little bit like safety net, how they do it, that they determine, okay, we're going to divide this big bucket of funding, and they allocate or they create a formula to determine who gets how much. Now, there is also a continuation award. That means that is an extension of what you have already received. It could also be a renewal. Some of these buckets of funding within the federal government is for 3 years. Years ago, it could be up to 5 years. They're no longer doing it that long. The most we can say is 3 years. And in order to protect the integrity of, the goals of that particular grant, what they do is that they said, we have this bucket is for 3 years, but we're going to start only with 1. If you meet the requirements and you perform really well this first year, you could be entitled to an extension or a renewal. And in that case, they could either open up another grant process only for those that already have the grant, or they may just require additional documentation instead of a full application. So the continuation process could be either way. Another term that we will hear a lot is when we talk about pass-through grants. That is the kind of grant that is not coming straight from the federal government, is going to another entity, in this case, a state agency. And then that's how it comes through us. And that is called pass-through funding. For those that are have to deal with audits, this is something that when we go through the audit process, we need to identify which of our grants come straight from the federal government and which ones come from pass-through agencies. And then we need to identify which agency this is from. This is just some terms. Yes, somebody wants to say something?
Yes, please jump in really quickly, Annabelle.
Yes.
This is Tariq, everyone. So just really quickly, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about pass-through awards. And I want to say that the continuation award, that one is contingent upon program performance. So in that context, you will basically be beholden to your measurables as they stood in the scope of work and the duration for the contract itself. And they don't look toward a lot of external documentation. And I think the other big point I wanted to jump in and say, we will be focusing mainly on grants and complimentary awards. The government doesn't give gifts. Gifts a lot of times come from foundations and such, but it'll be rare to find a gift from the state or from the government. Most of the federal, most if not all federal awards are designated and do follow the application process. So I just wanted to kind of say that in a snapshot really quickly before we move forward.
And actually, Tariq just reminded me something. There are times that people share documents with us and email us documents that they just come across. And if as soon as you open the document, if the notice of funding says continuation, you know that this is for someone that already have the funding, so you may not be applicable. Because sometimes in the means of sharing information with us, they could share a document with you that you're not applicable.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so I will get into it later in the presentation, but eligibility for award is a big point, big thing to focus on.
Mm-hmm. So just, a little bit more definitions, and then we're going to share with you a nice picture that took me forever to put together. So now you know that when we're talking about a pass-through entity, that is usually a non-federal entity, and they receive the funding from the federal government. So they are the pass-through entity. Then the recipient is also a non-federal entity that received the sub-award. And I'm going to show you an example pretty soon. I know that these are a lot of very technical words, but it's because sometimes when you're dealing with the staff from the government agencies, they use all these words and then you're like, I don't know what they're talking about, okay? So, but when we're talking about the subrecipient, that is not the actual beneficiary. That could be just like us, an agency that is managing funds to benefit others. The final subrecipient, the final beneficiary, is called also the sub-awardee. Now, in some documents, subrecipient and grantee and sub-awardee are used, I can't say interchangeably, but they use all the same word. Sorry for that. But, and that's one of the comments that we shared with the Tennessee Department of Health recently, that they are not including definitions in some of their documents, and this could be really confusing. So if that happens, that they use all this terminology and you may get confused, don't doubt on sending them an email. Okay, can you clarify who is the subrecipient? Who is this in this particular case? So let me show you a quick example. I use the disparities grant as an example. This is the disparities grant that we hopefully will get the contract soon, and that many of you provided a letter of interest already. In this case, the funder is really the CDC through one of their many departments, okay? Because they're huge. The pass-through entity or agency is the Tennessee Department of Health. By a semi-competitive process, TCCN was awarded funding, almost $4 million for 2 years. Then we became the subrecipient of that bucket of funding that the Tennessee Department of Health received. Now, we opened the process, we gave you an orientation, and everyone that provided a letter of interest will be able to then later sign a contract. That will be the sub-awardee, and those are the TCCN members that have elected to participate. And in that case, you see this, it's like step by step. Everybody is binded by the same terms and conditions. So if we are required to do a report that includes 3 sections, that information comes from you. So we share that information with you, and we also share the responsibility with you because we're sharing the funding with you. So it is implied that in this ladder, this step-by-step, everybody is bounded by the same conditions. So when the Tennessee Department of Health tells us You have until the third Monday of the month to complete the report. Is because the CDC is asking them for the report. So we need to ask you for the same report. So it's all connected. So I was trying to look for like a chain with links because we're all connected, but it wasn't possible. I was not able to find it. So that's what I found. But in other words, this is an entire process, and we're all bounded by the same terms and conditions. The funder sent it to the state agency. They selected us, and we share that with you guys. Any questions so far?
I have a quick comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to jump in front of questions, but I do have a comment about that. It's important for everyone to kind of pay attention to this because you have to follow the grant numbers. They want to discourage duplication of services. So often the CDC, HRSA, HHS will have similar initiatives that are funded at the same time. Although they encourage cross-pollination, if you will, they encourage support services. They do want to discourage duplication of services. So those of us who are receiving complementary funding, I know a lot of times you all have to do disclosures that kind of also talk about your different grant streams as well as your gifts. It's important to kind of follow the numbers and follow the funding as they come down to make sure that everybody is aligned with where they're supposed to be. And most importantly, that you all can demonstrate that this is complementary and not simply a duplication of services.
That's a good point. And some people, we have heard the word double dipping, that you need to make sure that you're complementing your program with different funding streams, but that you're not trying to ignore that you have other funding and you don't mention that. And of course, everything related with COVID-19, it's so big that you can have different funding parts. But when recently the TDH released the new request for funding or request for applications, they didn't mention that those that already had the disparities funding was excluded. And that's where we needed to immediately, okay, we need that clarification somewhere. And it's important that, again, when something is not clear, they usually have a pre-conference before you apply. Immediately post a question because then it becomes part of the record, or send the question in writing, okay?
And be sure to operationalize your own terms. So as the contract language may change a bit with different addendums, you need to be sure to outline your services in the context of themselves. So if you're providing the operational definitions, it's easier for your grant officer to tell you what category that definition would fit into. So a lot of this is cut and paste or plug and play, but you need to make sure that you're putting the right blocks in the right boxes.
Mm-hmm. So you notice that we have used several different terms when we're talking about funding opportunities. The federal government, as well as the state government, they use all these different words. So we wanted to include this here. So we know it's just a funding opportunity, but they call it different ways. An FOA, or an RFP, or an RFA, or an OFO, or an OFA, they're all the same. It's a funding opportunity. And when they are releasing that, they have to be some sort of document explaining who is eligible and what is the funding for. So all this is mostly the same. Now, there's some that could be at first just a funding opportunity announcement, but they say, we have this funding, more news to come. And then it's when they request the actual application that could happen. But we're living in such fast times that they are putting everything at once. And time for you to respond is very short, usually 2 weeks or 3, or even shorter. Now, the project period, this is really important. The award will tell you what is the the time where you need to perform? When is it that the award will begin and when is it that it's going to end? Remember that performance, and it's very weird to see that like they did it, the disparities grant where they have a pre-award period. That's not common. And I think it's because of the urgency with COVID, but usually they tell you that the grant will start X day and will end this day. So this is really important because if you have been working on that previously, those numbers, those metrics, you may not be able to use them here. They have to take place during the time that of the project period. And it's usually established in the award document and later also in the contracts, okay?
Yeah, it's worth reinforcing that that is very rare. They typically you have to stay absolutely absolutely in the boundaries of the duration of contract.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-award stuff, I think, had a lot to do with the pandemic and the movement of funds for with the CARES Act. So I think that this is a kind of a special situation, but don't bother with it. You all make sure you stay in your program parameters. So programs start and finish within the duration of the contract duration as written.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important to remember that usually in the contract, they say the end date is X, right? And so that means that most of the times the final report needs to be submitted before that. So that's important that, you know, when you're talking about the project, you're really clear of the beginning and the end and what is going to be your timeline. We're going to be talking about timeline soon, and we're going to show you some examples. But it's important that you consider that if this is the beginning and the end, what is your planning phase and what is your closing phase, right? How are you going to include those activities there?
Right. And that will be contract specific as well. So depending on who you're dealing with, if you're dealing with NIH or the bigger R level kind of research one grants, they have project periods, and then they also have periods of reporting that they will say that data collection will exist during this duration, and then there will be final reports Q4 of year 5 or whatever it may be. All of this will be laid out for you directly in your contracts, and you'll keep hearing me beat this drum. Read your contract, read your contract, read your contract. It's all going to be laid out specifically in your scope of work, but you need to stay in the parameters, especially of service delivery. So a lot of times with the COVID stuff and all of that, and service grants, they are talking about when services will begin and when services will end. And sometimes your reporting dates or your reporting periods will be a little bit different than your actual service dates. So that's something you have to pay attention to as well. But Annabelle is right. You need to try to stay within the window as much as possible and make sure that you are not providing any services at all beyond the service date. And well, we'll leave it there. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this brings us to the next slide. You know, before you apply, the first thing is review the funding notice. Make sure that you read that more than once. Make sure that you understand that application process. Even when they may look similar, they could be special restrictions. They check their timeline. When is it that you have time for questions? When is it that you have to submit which document? There could be some processes that they will require a letter of intent first. So make sure that you read everything back and forth, you take notes. But then the next thing is finding out, if your organization is a good fit. You know, one of the biggest errors that many nonprofits could make is just going behind funding just for the sake of funding. And then you made the big mistake of trying to apply for something that it's completely out of your purview in many ways. Let's think first, is this opportunity mission-centric? Is this something that ties to what you already do? Are you grant ready? What does that mean? Well, grant ready is a lot of things. First of all, what are the funded requirements? If they tell you that you need to have an administration process that you need to make sure that you can process your payroll or that you can submit some reports. Do you have the means or the ways to do that? Check your organizational capacity. Are you putting more and more tax to the people that are already almost tied up that they cannot breathe? Also check the timeline. The timeline not only for the application process, but also for the grant. What if you are saying that you're going to do this magnificent project and it happens that according to the timeline determined by the grantor or the funder, it's exactly when you are moving your facilities to a new building. So are you going to be able to perform? So there's a nice tool that we were able to find. Let me show it to you quickly if I can.
As you look for it, Annabelle, I will ring the chimes about making sure that whatever the funds you are looking at is mission-centric. So to Annabelle's point, it's tempting to chase funding because they have RFPs out pretty regularly. However, this system is set up to discourage that. And the reason that the turnaround period seems so short is because they are favoring capacity. So the idea here is that you are seeking funding that promotes and advances your mission. So the idea that it's all baked into the same cake, you are requesting complementary funding for services that you are implementing and growth that you, I guess, are moving toward in the area of your mission. That's what they want to encourage. And they want to discourage folks that are just kind of chasing different money streams. And the capacity piece, I think we'll get into a bit in a second about organizational capacity. And, so those, I think in order, those points, that understanding or recognizing that an opportunity is mission centric, and then checking for requirement eligibilities to see where indeed your organization fits in to the big funding structures is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. I'm sharing now, and let me know if you can see this document that says Grant Readiness Checklist. Mm-hmm. This was actually provided by one of the individuals that work as a consultant for the Tennessee Department of Health. But if you look online, grants.gov, NIH, CDC, they all have a similar document. And what it does is to help you think of what is being, a good fit, what really means to be grant ready. And it's most of the times a lot of documents that you need to have with you, but also how you do the work. How is your program set up? How do you run your financials? If you have internal controls. So this particular example is just read it and, okay, do you know what this is talking about? Do you know what is the EIN number? Do you know what is the DUNS number? And just do a quick analysis of your organization against this checklist. Most of the big funders have their own tools, and they actually provide you the link of one tool like this just to go through a checklist to help you think if you are ready. And this will help you not only know what are their funder requirements, but also your organizational capacity. Now, the application per se also helps you for the funder requirements. Now, the timeline is just looking at the application and trying to see the dates that they have there and your own calendar for your organization. So this is one of the tools that, there's multiple like this out there online, but this is something that we can share with you later. And this one has several pages, and because it's not, in this one in particular, it's not only the assessment, but for example, if it talks about the DUNS number, it has instructions how to go get it. So that's why I like this tool, because if you don't know if you can apply because you don't have it right there, you can go to this particular resource and then look at the instructions and just do it. And there are some things here that is just number or registration that the federal or state government requires. I have something in the chat. Yes, we're going to share all these documents later. When we send the recording, we will send all these documents.
And
Okay.
let me encourage everyone to go to grants.gov and download the toolkit. It's pretty big, it's robust, and it's a lot more than you'll actually need, but it's good for the purposes of exercise. And they will give you a lot of templates that you can type right into, and it's a great way to kind of vet out your project and see how it will fit into the scope. They even have scoring rubrics that you can kind of see where it will fall. So go to grants.gov, download the toolkit, and then we will absolutely share these specific documents.
Yeah, the CDC also have a great toolkit. So, you know, and NIH also have great toolkits and tools that are available online.
Right, and you want to look towards your specific funder for that. So you want to follow CDC guidance, of course, with CDC funding and so forth and so on. But grants.gov will give you everybody's overview is right there. So it'll give you a big general place to start.
So yeah, don't worry. In addition to, you know, that, then of course the first place that you will see requirements will be the application, you know, or the request for funding. Now, when you're working with your application, and this is when we're going to start moving between a lot of documents in a minute, so you can see them, not only hear my nice accent, but we want for you to see them. So almost all the requests for applications or requests for proposals that we have seen recently from the Tennessee Department of Health have the exact same sections, okay, that you see here. There's essentially 5 sections. Now, the project abstract or problem statement, others call it summary, others call it statement of needs, but usually it's just a couple of paragraphs explaining, or maybe just 1 page explaining what is this grant for and how you are planning on doing the work. Now, then you have the project narrative. And again, we're going to visit each one of these sections in a minute. The project narrative, it's your full project description. And that is where you need to explain exactly how you're planning on doing it, how you're going to address the needs that you mentioned or briefly described in the first stage. Then project management is how you're going to use your resources, either who's going to be hired, who's going to be supervising the new hire, and what other resources you have in your organization to make this work. And of course, how are you planning to evaluate that? That's the next section. There's always metrics. There's always a section where you need to talk about your data collection, and you need to talk about what metrics and how are you going to do that. And finally, we're going to be talking about the budget. You know, how much you need, what are you going to be doing with that? When we talk about the budget, we need to consider what is allowed and what is not allowed for that particular funding stream, okay? Now, let me start pulling some documents for you to see this. And in this case, Tariq is going to explain more in detail of what each section requires. Let's talk about, I'm going to pull that particular request for application, the recent one that we got from the Tennessee Department of Health. As you can see in this screen, first of all, can you see the screen? Yeah, okay. You will notice that there is an RFA number right here. Usually when you send them emails asking anything in relation to this particular request for application, use the RFA. Why? Because right now there's so many different funding streams about COVID-19 or disparities that it could get really confusing, okay? If we scroll in this particular document, the first thing you see here in their introduction, they're telling you exactly what they need you to do, what this funding is for. They even tell you to be considered for this grant. The proposed project needs to do this and this and this and this. So now you know your first hint, start highlighting sections in this document so it helps you remember what this is for. And what you need to talk in your project is exactly what they're telling you that they need. You can add additional, it's like a nice cake, you know that is for 100 people, make sure that is for 100 people. The frosting comes later. So make sure, first of all, that the contents of your application addresses what they are telling you that they need. And then you can add other activities. So here you see, they list all the sections that they want to see in your application. The first section, the abstract, what is your problem statement? Essentially, our suggestion to you, look at these questions and then make sure that in your narrative, you are addressing each one of these questions. Target population, what is the need? How you're going to talk about social determinants. Everything is here. Make sure that you have at least one sentence that addresses each one of these areas or these questions. You don't have to include the questions. Why? Because remember, most of the times you have a limit on the number of pages that you can send them or the format of the document. And if they want this double space, font number 12, and you have only 5 pages, if you have all these additional questions, it takes a lot of your space, right? So describing what is the problem statement. I know that Tariq has a lot of input about this.
Sure. It's actually, if you can, it's best to write your abstract last because it summarizes your narrative. So what they want in the abstract, they're playing a little fast and loose with the language here. Typically, you need to be careful. An abstract is a pretty fixed thing. They're usually under 350 words, and they do exactly what's laid out in the criteria. So it says the statement of need, it states the problem, the population served, the suggested or recommended intervention, the expected outcome, and you will follow each one of those bullets to kind of lay out the case in short order. You will get a chance in your narrative to get a little deeper into the weeds about how you intend to do each. But for the service agencies, I probably should have said this earlier. The big difference between service and research, they will also tell you in the grant that this grant is not for research or this grant is for research. Those are important things to point out, and it has a lot to deal with IDCs, indirect costs, and service grants. They won't tolerate high indirect costs with service grants like they will with research, because the bulk of the funding is supposed to go into the service itself. So you remember that as you're writing out your narratives and your abstract, you are demonstrating the impact of service and how these funds are complementing the service provision that you are already, they're complementing your existing service provision, and then you're actually showing real numbers. So in their abstract, they do want to know what your intended target area would be, all of the big highlighted points there. But your job in the abstract is to make a short order case that details the problem, the target area, the population, the recommended intervention, and expected outcome that lines everything up in one page. Oftentimes, statements of need can be a little longer. They can be executive summaries depending on who the funding agency is. But it's important for this example here to think about kind of a one-pager summary that takes the big interest points from the funder and answers the big funding questions all in one fell swoop. So, with citations as well up front.
So right under the project abstract or problem statement, we have the project narrative. In this particular case, in this RFA, they assign the same number of points. Usually in others, the project narrative has a higher scoring. And in this one in particular, they want to know your community involvement, strategies and milestones, your collaborations, and what are your plans for sustainability? Please note that they're asking you for the how. They're asking you to please describe, please explain. So that is a hint that they need details. They want to know more. Okay.
Right. Right. This is not aspirational here. They don't want kind of your big idea here. They want real practical application. So they want project partners, they want duration of project partners, complementary services, but they want you to kind of show how your agency is actively involved in implementation. And it's not just kind of a wish list of how you would like things to be. It is a very practical representation of outcomes and service delivery and outcomes within your within the context of your agency.
This is where in your project narrative, you need to make sure that you explain in detail what is it that you intend to do. Always remember or always assume that whomever is going to read your document may not know you. This is your time to shine. This is the moment when you need to explain them exactly. I want to do X. If, for example, when you describe the problem in your area, you talk about the particular needs for the African American or Hispanic community. Make sure, first of all, that if you're addressing those issues that you can cite, how do you know about those issues? What is your reference? Where did that information came from? And then in your project narrative, in the program abstract, you talk about how is this a problem? But then in your project narrative, you explain, okay, how am I going to address that problem? How is it that my strategies are going to contribute to solve this problem or improve something? So even when the other part is the first section is a summary, here is where you need to shine and you need to provide details. It's not repeating the same things over and over and over, but making sure that you can explain them and that visually they can understand, oh, that makes sense. They're going to address this problem with this solution. That makes sense. But always assume that the one that is reading this doesn't know you.
Good point, Annabelle. And this is so strong proposals stand on their own legs. They make the case for themselves. So it's your job to make sure that the case is not assumed. So you say, African Americans suffer disproportionately during COVID-19. You have to cite a source that demonstrates that. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there are disparate representations of COVID-19, especially in the South. Tennessee represents this. Whatever you have to say to kind of make your case, you need to make your case for every point that you're making. Beyond that, to the point that Annabelle says that the reviewers don't necessarily know you, what they attempt to do is they attempt to split up your proposals so that different sections go to different reviewers. This is a way to get rid of rater bias. So they want to show that the score is a valid score. And if they sent it to 3 different random reviewers that are reviewing different sections, those scores should still come back around the same. So the idea here that the proposal, and they're also trying to kind of discourage nepotism and things. So they don't want, the idea is that the funder is not familiar with the fundee, if you will, and they are evaluating these proposals based on the strength of the proposal themselves. That is the intent here, to try to get rid of the good old boy system and say that strong proposals can stand on their own. In that context, it is in all of our best interest to do due diligence in making the case. Oftentimes we assume a lot of things that we know are just true because they are so clear to us in everyday observation. Your job in building a proposal is to take current, you want as recent as possible too. You want to get as close as you can to current citations that make the case for you. And you also want to use sources, if you can, that are familiar to your funding source. So there are lots of different, the CDC and SAMHSA and HRSA, they put out studies as TDH, everybody, those are always kind of really safe sources to cite, but make sure you're building the case point by point, case by case, and not assuming anything in developing a strong proposal. And we will be, I don't know if we've said this yet, but we will absolutely available to all of you all to assist in strengthening proposals prior to submission. It's part of our training and technical assistance moving forward. So we will be available to kind of hold your hand and walk you through all of the different steps of this to make sure that your proposals are strong within themselves, but also to make sure that we are able to submit for complementary funding across networks.
Yes, I have several comments or questions in the chat. Judy is asking about the CAGE code and the NTEE code that she saw on the checklist. There's multiple registrations required by the federal government for different reasons. Once I send you guys the checklist, the information on what is it for and how to apply will be there in the checklist and the next pages of the checklist. Depending on the grant, it's possible that you don't need the NTEE code. Actually, I was trying to open the document to remember what NTEE means. I cannot remember, but SAMs and DUNS and CAGE are very common when you are trying to apply for the federal government. I know that DUNS is going away in April. They are no longer going to be using that, and they're going to use SAMs as the official code. And that is really a way for them to find out if your organization is in good standing with the federal government. And that's what many of these codes are for. But the instructions and the definitions will be included in the checklist.
Yes, and there are always code lists. So any codes that apply, they will always tell you in every grant there's a code list that details what agencies fall under what criteria, and if so, what codes need to be applied. So that there are lots of acronyms for codes, and as a part of your grant submission process, you will always check your code list.
Now, also, we have a question from Rhonda. She was asking specifically about the disparities grant and then LOI. You don't have to submit any other documents with the Tennessee Department of Health. Once we're ready to move forward for the disparities grant, and once we finally get the contract with the Tennessee Department of Health, we will be sending all those that submitted the letter of intent to us. We will be sending you a contract. That contract is important because it will state what are you signing up for, what are you committing to do, and how much we're going to pay you for doing that. So that will be the contracts already. It's just that I have not been able to send them until we actually get the final contract from the Tennessee Department of Health. In that case, also the question from Rhonda also ties with Mary's email last week about this disparities funding. They told us during the pre-applying or pre-application conference that this funding, that is the RFA that is on screen right now, comes from the same pot of funding that we already got, or we will get, the $4 million for 2 years. So if you're already in that bucket of funding, we cannot apply again. Now, we did some calculations based on the limited information that they have provided us about this RFA. We anticipate that the funding that we had secured will provide a better share to each one of the participants that this particular pot of funding. And how do we know that? Because they mentioned here that they are thinking about, to provide at least 50 grants for a total of 3 million something. And if you divide those 50 grants between this 3 million, I think it was about, I cannot remember if we did this calculation, it was about $70,000 or less, if I'm not mistaken. But this one will be only for 1 year. So this is another section that you always need to check how many grants they anticipate, how much is the bucket, how big is the bucket, what is the project period, is all here. So they were supposed to actually send the answers to all the questions on Friday. I have not seen the document. I don't know if any of you got it. And they were supposed to provide clarification about the fact that we had already applied and it's the same bucket of funding, if anybody else is excluded, all that. But we have already submitted the documentation and everything. You don't have to submit any of that to the Tennessee Department of Health. If you want to move forward with the disparities grant, moving forward will be our contract and our documents. It will be between you and us.
Which will be a much simpler process directly. So TCCN then will deal directly with the state, and you all will only have to deal directly with TCCN. I was on that call last week as well. I believe that they did say that was 1 year funding, and they didn't anticipate any additional funding to be associated with it. I believe they did say there were 50 grants at around 70 or 72K. So I believe
it's about 72.
Right. Yeah. So I believe, all things considered, if you had the option, if you all are thinking about the option, I would lean toward the disparities grant with TCCN, just because the LOI will suffice, and then we will troubleshoot all the way through, as opposed to dealing directly with the state. So I don't know if they haven't answered that question directly. I suspect your answer is going to be no. It comes from the same funding award. It was the same funding number, same CDC funding award, and that's what we talked about earlier about duplication of services with the same sorts of funding. So they're trying to discourage that. So I'm willing to bet here that even when the answer is going to come back, that it will be exclusive, one or the other. So I would recommend that TCCN members stick with the disparities grant in that context.
Well, then we continue with the next sections of the request for proposal, and of course, then what it should be in your application is the project management part or section. It's important that for that person that is reading your application, that again, you need to assume that person knows nothing about your organization. Let them know if you have managed a similar project. Let them know the level of expertise of your staff that somehow will be related with this grant. Also, any issues that you have experienced in the past and how you address that, because it tells the evaluator, how good are you trying to look for options and not just get stuck with problems. Also talk about any other opportunities that you have where you have partners. For the state agency, it's really important to see how much you can expand your work, because you have this amazing, connection with others, but you have to prove it. Not only right. It's important that in your application you specify with whom and what have you done with them. You don't have to provide, if you have 50, you don't have to provide 50, but you can just mention the 5 very strong partnerships that you have that relates with this particular line of work, but that you can say, I partner with this organization and we have done X. We have seen several applications, when we have evaluated applications, that it's telling us, oh, I partner really well with the community. How? Tell me how.
Yeah, and with what community and in what context? That's right.
So another thing, the next section is the evaluation. And that's when you need to talk about your data collection abilities. What are the metrics you're going to collect based on the particular needs that you want to address? And it's important that you tell the evaluator also how you plan to disseminate or use the numbers, collecting numbers just to keep them, it doesn't mean anything. How do you plan to disseminate or adjust your strategies based on those numbers? It doesn't matter if, what you're saying is that you will collect the information in a Google Sheet or Excel document, but please tell the evaluator what information you're going to be collecting and how, and then what you plan to do with it. Because that is the key to know if you really know about metrics, and it's not just that you're telling people, I want to do X, but you don't support your work with any factual data.
Right. And they do want a sort of evaluation plan for you here. And here is your chance to show that your agencies are making data-driven decisions. A really good kind of key term there. So you want to show how you are collecting the data and how that data is being used to inform your process moving forward. So you want to lay out your process of collecting data and the process of reviewing data, and whether or not you involve your community, if you have CAB, community advisory boards that meet quarterly, if you have boards that you share data with the board biannually. That's where you kind of lay out the process for data collection, kind of process and outcome evaluation, and to Annabelle's point also, how that data is being used for you to forward the work, so that it's your opportunity to show that you're making data-driven decisions, and you are, again, whether they're Excel spreadsheets or RedCap or whatever, and you are use the right language here. You want to say you're collecting de-identified data and you're in compliance with HIPAA and all kinds of, everything you're doing there to do and execute the good work. They want you have to lay your case out there for them. And they also want to make sure that to your project partners section, that there are no competitive interests here. There's no conflict of interest. So the reason that you lay out your project partners, and at the end of this, you'll lay out your abstract, what you intend to do, your capacity, your institutional capacity of how you exist, your project partners and your affiliates, and your project plan and your budget. So at the end of this, you can lay out a nice plan for execution where don't leave any questions on the table. Everybody knows what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it's getting done, and the funders want to know, how do you know that you're doing what you're doing, and how will you be able to demonstrate to the funding source that it's being done on a regular basis? And your answers are very clear about that. We collect data at these points and these points. These reports are published quarterly. We do this and this and this and this. So at any point you can kind of check in and check the progress of a given project. And they also want to see that your own people know the status of different projects at different times. So although it seems daunting, when you do pull it all together, it makes a lot of sense as a big comprehensive document, and it gives a timeline for when things are happening and when things can be expected.
Another thing that we want to remind you all is that in the actual application, they give you other details of the things that they're expecting from you. Like, you have to participate to webinars, you have to regularly be in meetings for the task force, you have to provide success stories. All that tells you all the metrics that you may need to collect. And
right.
so let me see if in this one they have it.
And those go on your project timeline too. So you build those right into your project narrative for your timeline. So the quarterly reports to your funding source or whatever they may be are built right into your project plan. Typically, they want a project, for larger scale grants, they want a project plan and a work plan. And they want this same information presented in 3 or 4 different ways. And that's for good reason. The short order kind of goes to the big money. The bigger proposal or narratives go out to different evaluators. The budgets go to different evaluators, and the scores come back from different places to kind of give the funding source an idea of who indeed can execute these services.
Another thing is that there's some particular grants that they actually, or applications that they actually have a section that talks about data collection, and they tell you you need to collect the number of attendees, the number of this. And if you also receive, in addition to this one, the Disparities Task Force, if you also receive the application for Community Health Worker, the new one that they opened, they actually have a list for with all the data collection. Kelly is asking if we can share one. Sorry, let me pull a document quickly where we did that, and it's our document, so there won't be any problems sharing that with you.
And point for point, if you are doing an information dissemination campaign, the question is, how is that being measured? If you're doing a PSA on the radio, what's the expected listenership? If you're passing out flyers, are you counting how many you're passing out? If you're counting attendance, are you taking attendance at workshops or at outreach campaigns? So again, your measures, whatever you're measuring, you need to make sure that if you're doing pre-test, post-test, that's great. You have to show that you're giving a pre-test, post-test, and how then or when or where, how, when, and where that's going to be assessed and evaluated, and then how you're using those numbers to inform the process.
I'm sharing with you right now a view of the proposal that we submitted the Tennessee Department of Health for the Community Health Workers Initiative. And as you can see now, they provide this particular setting or system where you need to include your information. And, this is one example of a project abstract or problem statement. In this one, you see their questions here because that's the setup that they have, and then how we describe that. We provided percentages. We compared the situation with Tennessee with other states. We talk about what we wanted to do. Sadly, you cannot see everything, but for example, look at this. We make reference of a Kaiser Family Foundation study. We mentioned that right here. When we're talking about data, and we said it's the state's data from the Office of Minority Health, and this, let me see if I can scroll down. If we got information from who, we put it right there. So the citations are right there. This is one example I wanted you to see. We provided exhibits. Now let's go to that particular section that Kelly wanted to see, which is the data piece. In the project narrative, we explain we will be doing XYZ, and we told them how. We talk about the 3 particular activities that we were going to do. So we were very specific. The project management, we talk about who is going to be included, helping us manage the project and how. We provided the bio sketches. We're going to talk about that in a minute, and we only have 15 minutes left, so I need to hurry up. We talk about each one of the staff members that were going to be included and are their level of expertise. And this is when we talk about proposed evaluation. This is what Kelly wanted to see. Where we're telling what is it that we're going to record, number of participants, demographics, individuals, all that we're going to keep event attendance, vaccination logs, satisfaction surveys. We're telling them what is the tool that we're going to use, right? What are we collecting and which tools? Well, we describe that right here. Vaccination logs, surveys, reports, and that, that we're going to provide a user manual on how to do this. So we're still talking on how we're going to do the data collection, that we're going to evaluate the data, that we're going to broadcast the results. We're going to include this in our social media. We're going to do webinars. We're going to update our website. Everything is here. So we're telling them what data we're going to collect, how, and then what are we going to do with the results? How are we going to disseminate that knowledge? And then the final section, it takes us to the budget. In the budget, we have a narrative of what is it that we intend to do with the funding. But this comes with a document that they provide. And this is the final section of the application per se. In this case, the Tennessee Department of Health always uses the exact same document, this form in Excel. Make sure that your calculations are right. The main thing that they want to see is you're talking about salaries and benefits, who is included in this grant. And that's why they have a detail section. Look that I'm navigating between these two different tabs. And we anticipate that later we can talk more on one of the other trainings, more in detail about how to put together budgets, how to do the assessment. What I do is that I keep a copy as an internal copy, and I keep all my calculations here on the side. So I remember exactly how I got to these numbers. In this case, you can add as many lines or rows as you need. You need to think of, you have a position that maybe would be here 100% of the time. You have another position that is going to supervise, so that person may be just 5% of their time. And then you add all that information. So what I do in this section next to it, and I keep all my calculations, I make notes to myself. So I remember why I took 10% instead of 15%, what I was thinking of. Believe me that after you have worked with 4 or 5 of these, you may not remember what were your assumptions, how you got to these numbers. So keep notes to yourself. And then you copy that document without all those comments, and that's the one you submit. But always keep an internal copy. When you're talking about travel, there's a lot of restrictions about travel within the state of Tennessee. The mileage reimbursement is based on 47 cents per mile. Do not show something bigger than that. Usually, when you're talking about a federal grant, you need to use the general standards or codes and rates determined by the federal government. There is another site that I'm going to share with you. It's called gsa.gov.
And those can be different. Those can be different. It's important too. The state and the feds can have different mileage rules. Yes. You need to follow your grant and move accordingly.
Yes, that's really important. They will tell you which ones you have to use. Right. We know that mileage, for example, the state of Tennessee only allows you 47 cents, even with with grants coming with federal funds. The feds allow you 54 cents, but the state is stuck with 47, okay? Even when the gas going up. So in that case, you need to read the restrictions. How do you know that? In the application, they will tell you, let me scroll there quickly, that you need to follow policy 03. So even when this is federal funds, you need to look at the account structure provided by the state of Tennessee.
Okay? That's a very, very important point. You are beholden to your state regulations. Mm-hmm. You have to really play by everybody's rules. So whoever has the rules that apply to you, you have to play by. Even if you could get away with it with the feds, you're still in Tennessee. You have to follow Tennessee's rules at all times.
Mm-hmm. So this and the policy 03 is older. Maybe I think it's almost as old as me, but they have not updated that document in a long time. But there is also policy 08, which is the one that regulates travel conditions for the state of Tennessee. And so every contractor that wants to make business with the state of Tennessee needs to follow policy 08, which is also very old. So the budget document is an Excel document. If you add rows, make sure that the formulas did not get messed up. Right. If you need any additional help, any one of you that want to, right now, the Tennessee Department of Health have at least 4 or 5 different funding opportunities. If you need any help with this document, remember, shoot me an email. Now, if you need more help with narrative and describing your project, Tariq is the expert.
We're here to help. Yeah, we're here to help. Just reach out.
So we can help you with that in any time. So those are the main 5 sections of the application. Although Now they have other attachments. Pay attention to those attachments. By the way, one thing that I do with the same language of the grant, the funding opportunity, they have this timeline. Follow the dates, because if not, you could be disqualified for that. But they have a checklist here. Let me see, right here. Do you guys see it? Checklist for submission of applications. I usually copy this and put it on a Word document or an Excel document, and I make my own checklist with this. And then I add the dates next to it. So when I get help from someone just to look at it, I make sure, the competitive requirements is here. That's a new document, by the way, that they are requiring. Make sure that you have it. And when you're putting together your folder with all the documents before you submit, make sure that you have everything handy. Right. This document, yeah, go ahead, Terry.
And I wanted to reinforce a point you made earlier. Use the precise titles. There's no room for creativity in grants. Don't try to be creative. Use their words, their terms in their order, and just answer their questions just like they asked them.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look quickly at the competitive requirements. It's a PDF. Now, the federal government is also requesting something similar. So the Tennessee Department of Health created their own. And what they are asking you, if you have a tax exempt letter from the IRS, if you have an EIN number, to put it here. And it's sort of like an additional checklist for documents, and they are actually, if you have a solicitation permit, and then if you don't, then you can do it right there because you have the link. So this is new, and it's also available in the TDH website, but we could send you this. What they requested, which is a little bit weird, that they're asking you for a list of your current board members.
They want that too. Yeah. They want that too.
They have this, Of course, they only allow for like 5 or 6 people. So you may need to add more pages here, but they want apparently just 5. And then this is important because they want to know if there's any conflict, if there's any board members related by blood or marriage. And they ask you, this is also important. No board member could be working for the state. This is one restriction, and that's why they have this here. No, employees or board members. So this is something new that they have added to the applications.
It's a new document. Incidentally, it's a new document, but it's always been a requirement. So you always had to sign. You always had to sign something that said we have no conflicts here. But now they're making you lay it out.
Mm-hmm. Something quick because we only have 5 minutes. The project timeline. I have another document here that I want to share with you. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, here's one. This is an example. This is the one we did for health disparities. So this format is available in Word. We just make sure that we made it to fit the requirements from the state of Tennessee. So you just mentioned, from month 1 to the 3rd or whatever, and then list your activities. This is a basic timeline that you could create. And sometimes they don't even request that. In this RFA, they're requesting it, but it really helps you plan to see, based on your general understanding of what you're going to do and how, if this is doable. So this is an example of a timeline.
This is when they want to see that your project is realistic. So if you're saying that you're going to do, you're going to serve 10,000 people in first quarter of year 1, it's going to play bad for you. So you want to make sure that everything fits into a reasonable timeline. And I need to make one more point on budget really quickly, Annabelle. Make sure your budget times are realistic. Remember, 10% of a full-time salary is basically 4 hours a week. So whatever you're suggesting this person is doing in 10% of their time, it has to add up to 10% of a 40-hour week. So make sure you're being careful with that, because that's where you get dung. You lose a lot of points for small things like that. And they're trying to make sure you're not just cramming services or cramming things on everybody's plate. I want to make sure that people have the time to actually execute what it is that you're suggesting needs to be executed.
Another thing, and with that comment, your budget also needs to show that. You know, if you're talking that you're going to hire someone, and in your timeline you said that from month 1 to the 3rd you will be hiring and training, then you cannot have that salary for that person allocated in this grant for 12 months, because it's not realistic. You need to hire the person. So maybe you need to hire that person for 11 months or 10 months, depending on your timeline.
Right, but you make sure it adds up. Everything has to add up.
Everything needs to connect. So that's why sometimes having somebody else that can proofread everything could help you. Another document that is a normal attachment with all the applications that now we have to submit to the state of Tennessee and or the federal government is a logic model. And in that, I'm going to show you one that one template, if I can find it. Okay. And this, again, Tariq has been an amazing help showing us how this works. How, you know, you don't put tons and tons and tons of language here. It's usually one sentence, you know, what is the need? What is the input? You know, what activity you're going to do? What are the outputs? So there are different types. There's sometimes, in this case, you see that you have outputs, and then you have intermediate outcomes and end outcomes. There's some of them, they just don't ask you outcomes in different times. Just make sure that you use a logic model that applies to that particular funding, you know, the particular application that you're working on. And right. The language is simple.
And I know I know we're out of time, so we will revisit logic models because these are perhaps some of the most important things that you'll do. But to summarize everything, your logic model is a visual representation of what you said in your narrative. Your abstract is a snapshot of what you said in the narrative. Your logic model is a visual representation of what you said in the narrative. You're saying the same thing in each different place, but in the logic model, you're showing how the logic of your argument is connected to the funding source, the intervention, the short-term and the long-term goals. And they want you to do that in a kind of a succinct way right there. So you're not supposed to fill it in with big paragraphs. That's what the narrative is for. And so the abstract, the narrative, and the logic model all support each other as complementary documents. They're all making the same case, but they're all providing different avenues of detail for the same case that you're making. So that's the way to look at it. And if I were all of you, I would focus on my logic model as a cohesive tool, because when you build everything around the logic of the argument itself, then the narrative kind of fills itself out. And then, of course, the abstract is written last.
Mm-hmm. And as you can see, that like I left some examples here. The language is very simple. You know, in this case, it's an outcome: increase access to materials, increase access to vaccines. It's something really simple. This is definitely going to be another one of our trainings, just about logic model and just about performance measures. So, you know, you have to stay tuned and look for the next emails where we send you the next topics. Now, we know that we are running really out of time and we want to give time for questions. Bio sketches for key personnel. There's also templates available if you go under the CDC website, BioSketches. We're going to send you a template that we pull, and it's not the same as the resume. The BioSketch has a different format and it's more simple. It's just like one page, maybe a page and a half. Right. Other documents that they may require is what we were talking about: the SAMS number, the DUNS number, your W-9, an ACH form. Pay attention, because for the state of Tennessee, the ACH form needs to be sent by mail to someone else. By mail, okay? Someone else. So it's weird, but that's the requirement. Finally, we want to emphasize a couple of things. Well, there's more than a couple, several things that we noticed when we were working recently, evaluating the applications for the community health worker. Always identify the sections in your application exactly as you saw them in the instructions. those 5 stages, okay? Those 5 parts. Be specific. Remember to explain, provide explanations on how. Don't stay just by, I do this. Sounds cool, but how? Remember, the evaluator doesn't know you. Always assume that. Describe the target population. Most of the time, they ask you about demographics. It's not enough just to say, in this application, I'm going to serve mostly this group of people. Why? Why did you pick them? That's your target population. Well, provide details, provide the demographics. It could be information about race or age or their health, conditions, what is going on with that population. Always cite your references.
And remember, you also have to demonstrate access. So it's not enough to say that this is an underserved population. You also have to demonstrate that you have specific access to this population. So be careful with that.
Mm-hmm. Describe how you're going to collect the data, what data and how. If you're going to use Excel documents, if you're going to use a survey tool, that is going to be even additional points for you, because you're going to the detail on how data is collected. And finally, always check for errors. Make sure that there are no typos, that there's no errors in your calculations, because that could, and depending on how strict the funder is, it could even disqualify you just because of a mathematical error. In other cases, it may just take points out of you, but in some instances, if there's something wrong, like with the federal government, they just disqualify you. So if you guys have any other questions, I know that we are 2 minutes over our event for today, but I really hope that we can address any other remaining questions.
Great presentation, you guys. Thank you so much for this. I do have a couple of questions. As it relates to statistical data, would there be any future training to help us navigate through those waters? I do know that the Department of Health has a specialized department in helping with collecting data. And if it's possible that TCCN can coordinate to help us kind of get through those waters. And then the other question that I have as it relates to different projects that our clinics may be already implementing or wanting to expand in, et cetera. Will there be any additional training to help us find other funders? For example, if we're wanting to focus on diabetes, maybe some funding opportunities as it relates to implementing a diabetic program or expanding one. So that's pretty much the questions that I had.
Thank you, Sabrina. And the answer to all your questions is yes, yes, and yes.
That's right. Awesome. And yes, absolutely.
We want to do additional technical assistance trainings for each one of the sections of your application, but with the help of Tariq, Tariq has all this knowledge of all these other areas that we can research and look for funding opportunities. And that's one of the trainings that we have in mind. So we were thinking of doing maybe one thing every month, or if, now that there's so many grants coming, maybe if you have any urgent need, just send us an email and we can coordinate specific time quickly. And I know that there's some applying right now for the different opportunities that the Tennessee Department of Health has. If you want us to read your application or your proposal before you send it, we're here to help you. But I'm glad to hear those specific needs, because that gave us a hint of the next topics and any other idea that you may have. And, just how to research grants.gov, how to research other websites to see what funding opportunities are out there. And if you can apply for them, we can help you with that.
Absolutely. And we plan to do it a la carte, meaning we plan to have something monthly just to address whatever the topic is for the month. But we'd also like for you all to chime in individually so that we could set up these studios. We would love to review, to strengthen proposals, and also to look for complementary opportunities for funding, because there's match funding available. There are foundations that fund in all of our clinics, all of our participating partners areas. So our job is to kind of circle the wagons here and make sure that we are strengthening everyone's proposals in everybody's best interest. So absolutely.
And thank you also for your comments. I can see in the chat that several people are saying that they enjoy. We were trying not to make it too technical, but you know, so we can all be, you know, on the same level of understanding of what is needed. But yes, we're going to have more trainings like this.
And Annabelle, can you share kind of, will there be an email coming out later that will have these templates? Some of the checklists and templates that you shared, can everybody from you?
Yeah, I'm planning on sending you the grant ready checklist and an example of the timeline, an example of the logic model. What else? Okay, I have comments here. At least Joe's, but you know, there's a lot to do with the budget document. It's provided by TDH, but if you guys have any questions about that, I can also help. So we appreciate everyone that joined us. We also appreciate your questions and comments. I hope that we can continue doing this work for you guys, and there's more to come.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.